Hello and welcome to our third webinar, From Overtourism to a COVID-19 Immobile World. For today's discussion, we have three eminent professors who are internationally renowned experts in tourism and sustainable development and policy. Let me introduce you to them. Firstly, we have Professor Claudio Milano from the Hostella Tourism Management School, UDL, and from the Autonomous University of Barcelona in Spain. Hello, Claudio. Welcome to our weekly webinars. Please briefly introduce yourself to our audience.
Head of Research Department in Hostella School of Tourism, Management of Tourism School, and adjunct professor at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. I am a social and cultural anthropologist, and I have been mainly doing research in rural and urban settings, and looking at the effect of tourism in those areas.
Thank you, Claudio, very much. And our second speaker this morning is Professor Joseph M. Chio from Wakayama University in Japan. Have I said that correctly, Joseph?
Absolutely perfect.
Thank you, Joseph. Welcome to our third webinar. Please briefly introduce yourself to our audience.
Thanks, Eugenia. Good evening, everyone. I'm in Australia at the moment where it's nighttime. So while it's morning for you, it's night for me. I'm based in Japan at Wakayama University, which is just south of Osaka. But I'm also an adjunct research fellow at Monash University in Australia, in Melbourne, where I'm from and where I am now. And it's great to join everyone for this third seminar, Eugenia.
Thank you, Joseph. And our third speaker, of course, is our eminent Professor Marina Novelli from the University of Brighton in the UK. Hello, Marina. Welcome to the third webinar. Lovely to see you again. Please briefly introduce yourself to our audience.
Of course. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for having me on this webinar with Eugenia. As Eugenia said, I'm Marina Novelli. For those of you who have not met me before, I'm a professor of tourism and international development at the University of Brighton in the UK. I'm originally from Italy, so I'm actually here in the UK in exile due to this lockdown that we are all experiencing. And my expertise is primarily in tourism policy and development for sustainable tourism. And I work globally, but in the last 10 years, I've been primarily focusing on the African continent.
Thank you, Marina. Okay, so how we will go this morning is that Claudia will open with a short overview of the core issues and research available to date on overtourism, and reflect upon this sudden shift to the current situation associated with the immobility, which is caused, of course, by COVID-19. Claudio will particularly refer to the European context. And this will be followed by Joseph, who will talk about the Asian context and Japan. Marina will then follow with the talk about the African context, drawing on some lessons learned from the Ebola-induced tourism crisis, and then conclude with her reflections on the key issues and challenges faced by the industry. Just a little reminder to our audience that at the end of the presentations, we will do again a Q&A with our experts. If you would like to submit a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A button on your screen. We will do our very best to answer as many questions as possible in the time provided. And so, without further ado, here is the first speaker, Professor Claudio Milano. Please start us off. Over to you, Milano.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. Let me share my presentation. Okay, perfect. Can you see it?
Yes, we can very well.
Perfect. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting us for this webinar. Talking about over-tourism is rather challenging and controversial matter in this time. And my presentation will be based on few years of engaging over-tourism related issue in the European context. For that, I have selected some reflection, and I will share the state of the art, and I also structure my presentation on what about the debate before the COVID-19 in terms of over-tourism related issues, where we are now, and what next, what we can expect in terms also of this evolving phenomenon. So where were we? We have been mainly discussing during these decades and at the end of these decades on how tackle over-tourism and tourism excesses. And what we have seen in the last couple of years was a great interest from tourist scholars, social scientists on this phenomenon. So in 2019, we had the first books on this issue, and was really in a short time we have seen so many different approaches. We had also different reports on this topic, as well as special issue and a lot of journal papers on and research on high-ranked journals as well on different topics that in a while I will try to summarize some of them. But of course, we have seen how in the last years this phenomenon evolved, but we cannot forget, of course, the legacy of critical scholars and all those authors and researchers that works on these issues. Probably all our audience, I'm sure, that are quite familiar with those theories, or some of those books that from the 70s actually were already alerting the academia and the communities at the global level of the cost of tourism growth. And actually, when we start to talk about over-tourism, there was also a kind of debate and actually the term of over-tourism has been often misunderstood and misinterpreted. Sometimes has been also said that it's a no-existent phenomenon. And actually, I'm using this picture of an iceberg because it seems that what we can see outside is the phenomenon of overcrowding. Yeah? But actually, underneath we have all those kind of over-tourism related issue and related excesses that are related with the over-tourism phenomenon itself. For example, we have had in the last years so many researches and studies on the increasing carbon emission, on the impacts on climate emergencies. Professor Paul Peters, Stephen Goffling, for so long have actually alerting the academia and civil society on the environmental impact of over-tourism, of carbon emission and the relation with tourism. And in the last years, actually, they are also associated this phenomenon to over-tourism. Ernest Cañada, for example, has done an amazing job on outsourcing of tourism employment and labor exploitation. And he also approached this phenomenon related with over-tourism itself. We had also other research on commercial gentrification, the loss in resident purchasing power, thanks to research from our colleagues like Robert Fletcher or Blasquez Maciá. We have plenty of research, Agustín Cocolagant, on this phenomenon of commercial gentrification, the relation between those over-tourism related issues in different locations worldwide. There was also another debate that is really interesting that we have had also here in Barcelona on the difference between touristification, the concept of touristification and over-tourism. On one hand, it seems that tourification must shed light on the political will. And that's why, since the last decades, with different research, touristification has been associated to the concept of tourism gentrification. So talking about over-tourism, we can see that there are a lot of related issue that we have studied in the tourism studies, and tourism scholars have approached all those kind of related issues, and we have now a huge academic production on those topics. On another hand, we have seen also how this phenomenon, what we can call over-tourism, has been a kind of unbalanced phenomenon. We have countries and societies, destinations, that are much more dependent. And in terms of a tourism density index, if we can use it, this was a study made by Intrepid Travel. Of course, we can see how clear is the unbalanced phenomenon. So country like Spain, Italy, Greece, Iceland, or Croatia present a huge number in terms of tourist arrival. And of course, all those kind of related issues that I just mentioned came out in those countries in a broader and huge perspective. For this reason, when also with Professor Novelli and Professor Chia, when we start to look at this phenomenon with the book we co-edited with our colleagues and the other authors, we start to look at this phenomenon from 4 theoretical frameworks and perspectives to understand why in the last years this phenomenon was booming, and why was booming, also having the legacy of critical scholars since the 70s. So the first one is what we can call the neoliberal turn. In the 80s, when we left what we can call embedded capitalism, and we got into the neoliberal stage of our economic system, there was a huge spatial reconstructing, regulatory transformation. And what is most important in terms of urban settings and over-tourism, the change of the city use. In this sense, from the 80s, we have seen how location turned into destination and the booming also of urban tourism. This is the first theory we use to look at or perspective and theoretical framework to look at the over-tourism concept that at the beginning seems to be more related to urban tourism, but of course is not. On the as a second theoretical framework we have used, and it could be also helpful to look at, is the new paradigm of mobility. Why I'm using new? Because at that moment when John Harvey, Tim Cresswell, Kevin Annam, and all those colleagues were really engaging this topic of the new paradigm of mobility, they call it new. Let's see now with next challenge and in the post-COVID, if we will have probably another approach on mobilities. They pointed out and shed light on how difficult it was to look at the tourism phenomenon in terms of the dualism we were used to use with the structuralist perspective. So with those dualism of host and guest, otium, negotium, ordinary experience and extraordinary experiences, home and away. So with the paradigm of mobility, we start to see how blurred those borders were. And also how other agents can play a key role in our destination, in tourist destination. For example, digital nomads, international students, temporary residents, lifestyle migrants. So those concepts, like from an anthropological perspective also, those concepts like otherness and alternative actually were much more were blurred and were changing a bit the way we were using in the past. So that's why when we talk about visitor, user, consumer, locals in this time, it's much more difficult than before. It's not so easy now to identify who is playing a key role in those contexts where there is a huge tourism pressure. On the other hand, we use also another theory, well-known theory, such as the social movement theory. I have been mainly in the last couple of years doing research with social movement and grassroots organization in the Southern European context. What we have seen is this phenomenon that I am mentioning here of the touristification of social movements. Actually, social movements before, they were looking at other kind of issue of our daily life and other kind of claims. In their political agenda, tourism was not really present. And now we have seen in the last year a specialization of social movements in terms of tourism related issue and a kind of tourism activism. For this reason, we are also with Professor Novelli and Professor Chia, we were looking at this phenomenon, and thanks to a special issue that Robert Fletcher, Hiva Murray, Asuncion Blanco, and Macia Blaskets on tourism and degrowth, we had the opportunity with other colleagues to look how the degrowth concept was coming back and also having a key role in social movements and grassroots organization claims, and not just in Barcelona, but in different cities. That's why actually a couple of years ago, there was the first city network of Southern European city facing touristification, the SET network. So I was looking at this phenomenon, doing different interviews and participating in those events, and to see how this phenomenon of the touristification of social movement was also helping to shed light on this, on tourism pressure, and tourism excesses, and over-tourism related issues. The fourth theoretical framework was based mainly on communication and what we can call yellow journalism and the media bubble. Of course, there was a booming in terms of medias and the international press that was really, really into to shed light on this phenomenon. And this also is important to look at, and is a theoretical framework that we can use together with others to look at this phenomenon. For example, the terms tourism phobia that was mainly used in Barcelona and Mallorca at the beginning in Spanish city came out also due to all the pressure and the international media, and the media bubble. Here we had a debate in Spanish city that how these terms actually was devalue and delegitimize the claim of those social movements, because it was not just about tourism phobia, it was about their rights and the claims they were and grassroots organization, political agenda, and not just a kind of phobia. So to end it up, this kind of this where we were, of course, we were coming from another important stage of the environmental and climate emergency claims, what we can call great effect and the flight chain was an important stage that, in a provocative sense, actually prepare us to these immobile words. And when we are talking about mobile and immobile words, as in a great book of Mimi Scheller on mobile justice, we don't have to understand those two concepts as a kind of dualism. No, we need to understand in a broader sense, and actually this immobile moment and epoch we are experiencing right now is an example of that. Where are we now? Actually, where are we now? And today, the 24th of April, of course, we are experiencing a great change and unprecedented crisis in terms of tourism mobility. And we have those kind of tourist spaces, destination and attraction with no people, like those places that were experiencing a big tourist pressure now are kind of empty. And what is really interesting for the tourism studies community and for us as scholars that are looking at the tourism phenomenon, how quick was going from a mobile world to an immobile world. Actually, the 96% of worldwide destination now have those kind of restriction. And how from an over-tourism stage, we are now experiencing a COVID-19 induced tourism crisis. And in this sense, after a couple of months, at least living this lockdown and this travel restriction, we have seen how some economies and some countries, of course, are experiencing a big impact, because they are really dependent on tourism. The case of Spain and Italy and Mediterranean region are a great example of how a huge dependence on tourism can bring those economy in a state of crisis. And another debate that we are having now, looking at the social movement perspective, here, for example, in Spain and in Barcelona, is what the claim of social movement right now here, and is to don't use any kind of public rescue for the tourism sector. But on the other hand, we are seeing how those companies and those enterprises, small company, without paying their taxes, of course, they are generating also a kind of crisis. So we are having now this debate here, and it's really interesting to follow up and also to look at it in a critical perspective, and how can such dependent city and context in terms of tourism industry can come out from this induced crisis. Where next? My friend and colleague Joseph Chia, Professor Chia, will talk about the Asian context. So I'm not going to explain anything about that, but I think it's this picture and what has actually happened one day after the lockdown was breaked in China and in the Wangshan mountain is an example of how we have short memory, and also how we need as a community to work on critical issue and how we can look at the post-COVID tourism in a much more inclusive and sustainable way. So for this reason, I will share with you some conflicts, expectation, and needs we can have for the post-COVID stage. A great colleague, Nogués Pedregal, published last year on Annals of Tourism Research the relation we have between anthropology and tourism. And this sentence, I think it's really powerful. It's talking about power, of course. Tourism is just another name of power. For this reason, from a critical point of view, from critical studies of tourism, we need to approach the phenomenon and the power relation. And we have seen the power relation underneath the tourism phenomenon. And we have seen, as I mentioned before, how those economies that are really, really dependent on tourism, they actually experience a huge crisis. Thailand, Philippines, Mexico, Spain, Italy. And now it's really hard to imagine the next future of tourism and tourism mobility for those economy, and how those economy can recover being so dependent on this industry. So let me share with you some key concepts we need to look at when we are talking about power relation in tourism. Tourism employment and the labor issue is really important. We really need to do research on this topic, and more also later in the post-COVID. We need to put on our research agenda all the problems that we are facing right now with precariousness, temporary job, 0-hour contracts that actually are been highlighted during this crisis. Imagine, for example, there's in Spain that we are tourism represents the 12% of GDP. All those we have a lot of temporary job in those economies. So we really have to put in our research agenda as tourism scholars the tourism employment and the labor issue. On the other hand, in this phenomenon that I mentioned before of turning location into destination within the neoliberal term, of course we have seen what's also in biopolitics terms, an hygienization of our society. The global fear, this is a picture from the 1900s of New York, and now this is a picture of some days ago in Venice. So the other one in Venice of a couple of years ago. Venice, not Disneyland. Of course, we are experiencing an hygienization, and we will face a legible society. And this legible society will be always more and more under control and under strict vigilance. And in tourism terms, we need to face those kind of needs and expectations. For example, health and safety. before tourists probably expectation after the 2001 and the terrorism attack in New York was where a tourist could be and could go and could be safe for him or her. And now, of course, health and safety will be the core, the core of those expectations and needs for travelers. Travel insurance, return policies, and hygienization. This is a picture of Santiago de Chile of some days ago, and probably we will face this kind of expectation and needs. And then biosecurity. Biosecurity will probably accompany us in this next stage. What's also with another colleague that is looking and to the over-tourism phenomenon, Coco Owens from the University of Holland, and we were discussing these days. Could you imagine before the 2008 crisis, Airbnb coming out, and now what about the 2020? If after the 2008, we have seen so many companies getting into the tourism market like Airbnb, which challenge and which kind of how tourism will reinvent itself now after this crisis? Because like it or not, our economic system is, and in the neoliberal stage, those crises are a kind of constant, unfortunately. And then we have seen after 12 years that we are really close to another. We are experiencing another big crisis where probably tourism will reinvent itself again. So how I'm saying from an anthropological perspective, I am really uncomfortable with the concept of social distance. We need to talk about physical distance. And so how will be physical distance and tourism mobility? How we can match? And just to ended up my presentation, those images and those pictures are picked up from the debate we are having in Italy. How will be the next summer? How will be the summer season and physical distance? Will it work? So now there are a lot of consultancy company working on how could organize our summer season in times of physical distance. So just to end it up and to leave some to end it up my presentation, I want to share a milestone book on the costs of economic growth of Edward Mission. In the 70s, at the end of the 60s, he already was talking about the cost of economic growth, and he mentioned tourism several times in his books. And after 15 years, almost 5 decades, we still are facing and try to tackle those kind of phenomena in tourism excesses. And of course, in the last decades, we have seen all those over tourism related issues popping up. What we need to do? It's difficult to forecast, but of course, strengthen state apparatus, a feminist approach, talking about labor and decent work, talking about social justice, talking about dynamics of participant governance, inclusive approach and climate-oriented approaches needs to be on our research agenda and needs to be topics and approaches and perspective to use in terms of how we can face the post-COVID, and the new step of our tourism phenomenon. So that's all for me. Thank you very much, Eugenia, for giving me this opportunity to share this state of art from overtourism to an immobile world.
Well, thank you very much, Claudio, for your thoughtful presentation. It's really good to hear it from a different approach, the sociological, the anthropological perspective, bringing into your presentation. Very, very interesting. Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And our second presenter now is Joseph. Over to you, Joseph. Looking forward to your presentation. Thank you. Your camera, your microphone is off.
Okay. Can everyone hear me now?
Good morning.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you, Claudio. Let me try and share my presentation now as well. I think you can see my slides now.
Yes.
Okay, like any good academic, I have a number of slides for you. In contrast to what Professor Milano has just been talking about, I will go the next step and just explain some things in terms of the approach I will take. What I won't do is cover the theoretical perspectives that Claudio has already described quite fully, as already explained, and as you can see on my slide, I'm going to take a look at the Asia Pacific because this is where I'm based and where most of my work is based. I understand there are some colleagues in China who might be watching, so I put my WeChat QR code there if you need to ask any questions later, if we don't have any time or if we run out of time, as well as my Twitter handle there. So the Asia Pacific is what I'm going to focus on. And as Claudio has already explained, we've lurched from one end of the pendulum to the other. We've gone from a time of over-tourism to a time of severe under-tourism, or some would say no tourism. So it's a big contrast in such a small space of time. What does this mean for over-tourism? What does this mean for tourism in general? And I don't know about anyone else, but my crystal ball is not a very good one, and it won't tell me what the world will be like in 12 months or even 24 months, right? So as a disclaimer, what I will say is I'm reluctant to guess how things are going to be, but I'm going to describe what we see now and what we might expect from an Asia-Pacific perspective. My segment of this webinar is largely descriptive. I will look at a bunch of data from the World Bank and the Pacific Asia Travel Association and the UNWTO as well, and what the implications are for the Asia Pacific. Specifically, I will look at Japan. As I've said in my introduction, I'm based at Wakayama University in Japan, although at this point in time, I'm in Melbourne, my hometown in Australia. So I will try and cover the vast expanse of the Asia Pacific. But one of the first things I need to do is say that, if we talk about the Asia Pacific as a homogeneous region, that's quite fraught because, as I will explain, the Asia Pacific is quite a diverse region made up of countries from the highly industrialized to the still very much developing. So what does this mean? What does all of this mean for tourism? From over-tourism to a COVID-19 immobile world. So just to introduce the region, I'm not going to assume that everyone's relatively familiar with the region. So if I'm telling you things you already know, I apologize in advance, but I'll try and do it for the benefit of those who might not have a really good understanding. When we talk about the Asia Pacific region in the tourism context, what we're really talking about is Asia. The Pacific forms a very small part if we talk about the Pacific being the Pacific Islands. So what we know now, or what a famous man said, the known knowns. As we know, Asia, as a vast region, was the initial epicenter of COVID-19, China in particular. What we see in response to that were individual approaches across the region. For example, when I left Japan to come to Australia about 4 weeks ago, Japan was doing quite well from a numbers point of view. But in the last 4 weeks, things have deteriorated quite a bit to the point where there is a state of emergency. Nothing to do with my leaving, of course. Also, travel restrictions and border closures are enforced across the region, much like the rest of the world, right? To varying degrees. In some countries you can enter, providing you meet particular requirements. In other countries, the borders are closed completely, much like the Pacific Islands. So there are states of emergency in place. In Japan, there's a state of emergency for another couple of weeks. In Australia, there is one in place as well in different states. What we also see is the foreclosure of tourism enterprises across the region. And this is no different in other parts of the world as well. Airlines, travel agencies, hotels. This is proving to be quite catastrophic. We see very limited air mobility around the region. For all of those who think that tourism will make a relatively quick rebound, unless we can get air mobility going across the vast region of the Asia-Pacific, we really will be in an immobile world, as Professor Milano has just described. There's a lot of destination management rethinking going on, particularly a focus on domestic tourism. We see this in China, we see this in Australia. So perhaps what's going to be the accelerant for tourism to bounce back will probably be domestic tourism. And this is quite significant because in some countries in the region like China and India, very often domestic tourism is under-acknowledged as an economic driver. Much of the emphasis is put on international arrivals. Then we see in more recent days the narrative of reopening or economic reopening narratives in China and Australia. Already in the region, we are talking about reopening the economy. And for those who want tourism to bounce back and for those who rely on tourism, these are good noises to hear. However, if we look at Japan, especially in Hokkaido in the north, where they thought they were very safe about 4 weeks ago, there's now a second wave of infections. So what does this mean if the economic reopening is too hasty? And also, many commentators suggest that the Asia-Pacific will be the worst hit, particularly countries in Southeast Asia, where tourism makes up a larger part of their economies, and Southern Asia, and where diversification is quite limited. So that's just a rough snapshot of what we know now. If we go to very early in February 2020, we see when the coronavirus epidemic was still very much in its infancy outside of China, we see that already at the beginning of February, arrivals had started to drop quite significantly. The data for March and April is really hard to come by, but you can imagine that arrivals have dropped quite considerably beyond the 80 and 90% levels even, not including, if you include returning nationals to their home countries. So the impact is quite significant. And talks of this being catastrophic, I think, are now are beginning to bear fruit, because we see this economic slowdown having some considerable impact across the region, especially in the middle income and low income countries in the Asia Pacific region. But in terms of mapping the region, I wanted to do a really quick run through, and this is good. We're going to travel through Asia without using up any carbon. So for all of you watching, we're going to do a quick Asian trip, and it's all climate friendly. So we look at Asia. There are some very highly industrialized countries in China, very highly industrialized cities that across the region. That's Shanghai in China. Now, for all intents and purposes, it's a first world city. Then we look at Japan. Japan has been highly industrialized for a long time, and that represents one spectrum of what Asia is like. If we go to the other end of the spectrum, we have still a number of middle and low income countries that are agrarian and primary production based in Southern and Southeast Asia, especially on the Pacific Islands. Here we have a picture of the rice terraces in Bali, in Indonesia. But alongside of that, we have a number of countries in the region. Of course, the Pacific Ocean, which encompasses a lot of the Asia Pacific. We see agrarian livelihoods tied to the oceans as well. And in this case, this is Myanmar. So what this is showing us is that there's a linkage between all of these things and tourism. We see here in India, the services economy is a big part of the economy in general, but for tourism, it's essential. What are these, how is this slowdown impacting livelihoods and incomes for people who have relied on offering services to tourism and beyond? Similarly, in here, this is in Thailand, the fate of many micro enterprises in these countries have also faced considerable constraints over the last few months. And in many of these countries, there isn't necessarily a welfare safety net. So how are they coping? And when we talk about an economic reopening, the imperative is quite considerable for many of these countries. So more services linking to the economy in general and to tourism. And then we also look at the cultural and heritage assets, especially a lot of, especially critical heritage. Tourism, by and large, provides an enormous resource to be able to protect and maintain these cultural heritage assets. What is the situation now when there is a downturn in tourism, where the critical income towards maintaining and preserving these assets have long gone? And once again, cultural heritage assets in places like Japan as well. And of course, nature-based assets. When livelihoods are compromised, to what extent is nature and heritage protection seen as something that is still a priority for many communities when you don't have food on your tables? So the impact of the tourism slowdown is considerable. But let's look at the status quo in the Asia-Pacific region before all of this, right? Before the end of the year, there was a great deal of hope that 2020 would be unprecedented from a tourism arrivals point of view. I wanted to provide that global snapshot so you can see the significance of tourism in the Asia-Pacific region at 25% of the total share and growing. And if you look in that map I've got there, the colors, that it looks green to me. Asia covers a vast expanse from Central Asia all across to Southern Asia and beyond down to the Pacific. So tourism is a considerable economic activity in this region. Another snapshot from the UNWTO, we see that all of those growth rates mean nothing now, right? The Asia and the Pacific was the second fastest growing region as far as international tourism arrivals was concerned. All of that means nothing now. So to try and project 6 months ahead is probably quite fraught. So let's look at let's drill down to some specific data. If we look at arrivals in general, when we talk about tourism in the Asia-Pacific region, this is the kind of trajectory we've come used to seeing. Over the last 25 years, there's been nothing but growth, with a few little blips along the way to deal with the Asian economic crisis in particular. But this emphasizes the resilience of tourism in being able to bounce back. Okay, but if COVID-19 is unprecedented, then will we be seeing this trajectory continue in the medium and long term? If we drill down into particular countries and we look at where the action is happening, we see that China clearly is where much of the action is happening, and is really the engine, not just the economic engine for the region, but also the tourism engine. We also see that there are some outliers. We see a country like Thailand, always in the top 10 in terms of arrivals over the last few years. Of course, a middle-income country, not as diversified as, say, Japan. What does this slowdown in tourism mean for the economy? It would be quite considerable in terms of its economic impact. So, okay, and then if we look at departures, where most of the tourists are coming from, we can see that China and Hong Kong, as a special administrative region of China, by a long way drives tourism in the region. And if we say that tourism out of China will be somewhat constrained over the next 12 to 24 months, what does this mean for the rest of Asia? Okay. In terms of dollars, I mean, I guess this is where it's important. If we look at a contrast between arrivals and dollars, we see Thailand, Hong Kong, and all of the other emerging Southeast Asian economies starting to show a great deal of potential for tourism receipts. Okay. And what about as a percentage of total exports? And this is really, really important, because in the post-pandemic wash-up, it's the countries that are more diversified from an economic perspective that will be able to bounce back. Countries like Thailand and Indonesia and Malaysia that are slowly developing a more diversified economy will bounce back more quickly than others. For example, in the Pacific Islands, in some of the countries where tourism makes up more than 50% of their GDP, that will be quite difficult to make up very quickly. And of course, as I've said before, China's the growth engine. If we look at that graphic, there's no question, a slowdown in China, or as they used to say in the financial markets, if China sneezes, the rest of the region will more than get the flu, right? In this case, if China sneezes, the rest of the region are going to get something far more significant than the flu. So my focus and where I work at the moment is in Japan. And as one of the most industrialized nations in Asia, what we see is this considerable emphasis on tourism. Absolutely amazing. And we can see when we use the word, often the word exponential is used very loosely. But if we look at from about 2010 to 2018, the growth has been at a rate of over 200%, quite considerable, right? Raises questions about sustainability and all of that. But what does this mean as a whole? We see that forecasts for the Asia Pacific were quite bullish. They were talking anywhere between 3 to 6% growth. In some countries, it was much more. The 728 million international visitor arrivals in 2019, with the expectation that 2020 would rise again. But of course, that's not going to happen. So what we see is that the growth momentum of Asia Pacific, as both as a receiver and generator of international visitors, is becoming considerably more significant. 2023 was going to be something that was going to surpass all previous arrivals, but of course now that's in question. But of course, 2023 is still 3 years away. Could this reversal happen very quickly? There's all talk about tourism being conducted in a different way. That all remains to be seen. And as always is the case, growth in international arrivals across Asia Pacific and globally is often unequal, with some countries experiencing far more rapid rates of growth than others. Okay, again, I'm going to look at some economic data just briefly. We see China, Hong Kong, Korea, and Malaysia, countries that have grown by over a million arrivals in the last 12 months. Of course, that's going to change quite considerably. We see visitor receipts. Here you see the USA included in there, and that's because the USA is a member of the Pacific Asia Travel Association. If we remove the USA, we see that receipts in Thailand, Japan, Malaysia are all up quite considerably in the last year on year. But where are the tourists coming from to the region? And this is a really important point, because much of the recovery will come from visitors that are in close proximity to destinations. We might find that in Africa, when Marina explains, does her session. We might find that in Europe, where Europeans might travel more within Europe and less. There might be more short haul, less medium and long haul travel. And this is a concern for countries like Australia, where I am now, in New Zealand, right? Where most of our international tourists have to come on a plane. They can't get a train because it's not realistically possible yet. But what does this mean in terms of modes of recovery? Will they be not just domestic, but intra-regionally? And we see here within Europe, within Asia rather, at least 3/4 of all the visitation comes from countries within the region. And that probably signals where this recovery might come from. This is another infographic that kind of explains what I've just talked about. This kind of intra-regional growth will be intra-regional recovery will be an important aspect that we need to keep an eye on. So what are some regional trends that we can see at the moment? Clearly, before COVID-19, there was increasing visitation to many of the popular destinations, especially in Southeast Asia and China. Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia were the stars to some degree. But there was still a concentration of tourism activity in the key nodes within popular destinations. Improved access to the destinations via low-cost airlines is what drove a lot of this. But what we see now, a lot of the airlines that are dropping off are the low-cost airlines that aren't able to sustain having not been operating for a long period. But one thing in particular that I'm keeping a key eye on is the growth of cruise tourism. There were quite enthusiastic forecasts. But what we see now is that COVID-19 has probably had an impact on cruise tourism more than any segment of tourism. What does this mean for what was supposed to be the growth engine in many countries in the Asia-Pacific region? I won't go through that data because it all means nothing now, right? Because all of those future forecasts can be consigned to the bin, really. So when it comes to over-tourism and what Professor Milano was talking about, how has this been manifest in the Asia-Pacific? Of course, the Asia-Pacific was where many of the regions first started reacting and closing down. We see Maya Bay. Everyone would have seen the movie that Leonardo DiCaprio was in. Was one of the first to say, the best way for us to respond to over-tourism is to close down and recover. We also saw the same thing in Komodo Island in Indonesia. So this idea of closing down a destination up till now was unheard of. We also see this emergence of cruise tourism visiting very, very small communities. And this is a photograph in the Pacific Islands. And the question that's often raised is, what is the economic and cultural impact together, not just the economic impact? So now I go across from Asia into Japan, where I am at the moment. What does this mean in Japan? And I'll share some photographs. This is over-tourism personified, right? This is Kyoto, the old town of Kyoto. I mean, for most people, you look at something like that and you ask yourself, is that really going to provide a good tourist experience? What does that mean for the vendors? While you have many people in the streets, very few people are buying and many people are taking photographs, right? It's the same as in markets in Spain and other places. Here we see this concentration of people in the same destinations. So the idea of dispersing people more widely becomes even more urgent. We see this, in critical heritage, in temples and religious places, places of worship, where we see millions of people milling around these places on a daily basis. And I'll just make a diversion to China. What is interesting is that while clearly in Japan there are expressions of over-tourism or tourism pollution, in China, by contrast, where they're more used to crowds, I'm yet to hear the words over-tourism. So it raises the question, what does this mean? Is there a psychological or cultural angle to over-tourism? And in Japan, again, I've already flagged this, that growth is phenomenal. It's a growth that most destinations would have looked at in envy, right? But now it's under a serious risk. We see that arrivals year on year have just been going constantly increasing. We see the same thing in Japan. Over 85% of all arrivals are from countries around it, especially China. And we see that in Japan, a nation of people that are usually not as vocal and actively protesting like they do in the Mediterranean, like Professor Milano has just explained, there is a protest bubbling, suggesting that maybe we don't want this much tourism. There is a protest bubbling saying we are being swamped by tourists in a way that we never had intended to. There is also a sense that places that are quite valuable, like in this case, the bamboo forest, are under threat from too much tourists. They're losing their unique sense of place. We also see these religious and critical heritage places being unable to turn away visitors, or suddenly thinking about, how do we turn away visitors now when in the past we wanted to welcome them? We see this idea of, how do we modify tourist behavior? How do we modify tourist behavior where the cultural dissonance between the visitor and the host is quite considerable? Now, in some respects, that's over-tourism as well, right? And this is what Claudio had said earlier. Over-tourism has often been generalized as overcrowding, but it's far more than that. And this idea, often it's the economy that drives, it's the economic impact that drives this kind of yearning for more tourism. We see in Kyoto, once again, trying to balance satisfying the people who visit the city, as well as the well-being and interests of the locals. We see the mayor also saying, we know it makes a big contribution to the economy, but at the same time, crowding and behavior are becoming issues. How do we ensure we protect our traditional industries from too much tourism? And this is a really interesting post. I'm not sure if you can see it. This is something that that was produced in Kyoto to try and educate tourists in a way on how to behave. because part of the over-tourism phenomenon is what they call in Japan tourist pollution. This idea that tourists somehow ruin the well-being and the way of life. So some of the key takeaways towards I'm at the home stretch with my presentation. While many tourists want to live like locals, you know, the phrase the question that often comes up by many locals, what if I as a local can't live like a local anymore? Surely it's more than overcrowding, right? The idea that cities transform to cater for tourists and that this can be managed. But more often than not, despite management and planning and everything else to try and control and guide tourism, the global travel supply chain often overcomes all of that. And it's exemplified by the sharing economy. You know, Airbnb doesn't really interface with the destination managers of the city. Airlines, they don't necessarily do that either. And so, as Claudio has mentioned, this coincides with a number of inadvertent impacts: property speculation, rising costs of living. And when these limits are not acknowledged, that's when we get to what Claudio referred to as over-tourism. And the question that many of our colleagues who think that over-tourism is probably not a thing, that local government and planning can overcome this. But as we've come to understand, there's a certain limitation to local government and planning before the global supply chain takes effect. So managing the flow of tourists is an improbable and unwelcome task. Demarketing, new laws, taxation, all of these things that have come in places like Kyoto as well. So how do we reconcile all of this? And in terms of being able to criticize over-tourism and to criticize too much tourism, as academics we've done, we must also think about what are the viable solutions, because when communities' livelihoods depend on tourism, we can't just say, well, it's a case of too much tourism. We want to also think about what the viable solutions are. Okay, so I also think tourists should play their part by making travel choices that are sensitive to the places they visit. But of course, I'm not very optimistic about that, because as we see, cruise tourism bookings for the 2021 season are already showing much higher levels than 2019 for various reasons. What does that tell us? I mean, we can extrapolate, right? But what that tells us is that behavior change is probably a really difficult thing to achieve. Perhaps over-tourism has been a symptom of our unprecedented affluence and hypermobility. But that all comes to a stop right now, right? I think COVID-19 has seen to it that has to change. So we've talked about all the drivers already: privatization of public spaces, rise in visitation to fragile destinations, and so on. So I won't go into that. Claudia talked about some of the inadvertent impacts, and these are the same in countries like Indonesia and Thailand: labor exploitation. I also write about modern slavery in tourism, and this is partly what I'm referring to there. So as far as policymakers are concerned, what do they do? How do they enforce a paradigm shift? Everybody's talking about a paradigm shift, right? But what is this paradigm, and who's going to make it shift are the questions we still have to answer. So in conclusion, you know, is over-tourism emblematic of the way we consume as humans and the way we live, and how governments govern, focusing on growth continuously? This is best put by a good friend, and Tony Wheeler, the founder of Lonely Planet, who says in his book that what often raises people's heckles and makes local communities annoyed is when they sit next to the development but are not involved with it, where they see people making money from it, but it's not them. How do we address this in the post-COVID-19 period? And lastly, this is something I wrote the other day in an online journal, where I say that a big responsibility rests on the tourism industry to rethink the way it engages with communities, right? Theoretically, this is what we need. Practically, the challenge is, how do we do that? So that brings me to an end.
Well, Joseph, thank you so much for your inspiring talk. It was very, very interesting to hear about your perspective in Asia and Japan. Thank you so much for your contributions. And our last speaker now is Professor Marina Novelli, who will talk about the African context. Marina, could you please have your microphone on?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can see you now. We can also see you. So you may well start now.
For some reason, there is something really weird happening. Okay, sorry. I had a moment of panic earlier, being locked out of the right. I don't know why it's not letting me share. Just give me a second. I'm trying to share my presentation.
Okay.
Share screen. Why is not allowing me? Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Right, okay, I'm gonna go on presentation. Right, here I am.
Excellent.
Okay, so, well, I suppose what I need to do is to follow from what Joseph and Claudio have obviously outlined. I'm not going to go into the specific of it. And what I've decided to do today is very much to look at this from a practitioner perspective, particularly because beside our academic colleagues and students and the bigger community that deal with tourism globally, I felt that my discussion and my reflection could really much refer also to the more practical and practitioner world. So I'm not going to look at it from a purely academic perspective, but possibly more from an applied context. Now, many people question whether over-tourism has ever been an issue in Africa. And like in many other parts of the world. I mean, I particularly liked Claudio's representation of the difference between overcrowding and over-tourism, which are very often two terms which are used interchangeably. And the reason why I like that is because effectively what the overcrowding, which is what you see in these particular pictures featured here in these slides, is merely I would say the symptom of much bigger problems which lay behind. As my highly respected colleague, Judy Kefragona from Kenya, highlights in one of the chapters she wrote for our book, the issue related with over-tourism in Africa may be very much linked to the issue of capacity to deal with the continued tourism growth, particularly in areas which may not be prepared to even understand what the tourism sector may mean in the short, medium, and long term. So effectively, what we've seen and what we've been in a way pushed to believe, and in a way, if you look at the global tourism growth paradigm, which has been promoted for the past 50 years in a way by all global players, including those in the African context, the idea that tourism growth would lead to potential sustainable development have been questioned from many perspectives. And of course, now that we find ourselves in a context where the sudden drop of tourism means that there will be some fundamental repercussions, and the quest for revisiting the models that we've been using for so many years is not a surprise. What we have obviously seen in the first quarter of 2020 is indeed the global drop of tourist arrivals. And if you look at the particular context of the African context, which is where I am primarily focusing my attention to, of course, the idea of looking at an average of 30% drop in arrivals in the continent, it has repercussions that go far beyond what we are being generally exposed to. One difference that is very much clear between the context that we've seen before, so the European context, the Asian context, and of course the African context, is that what COVID has done is in a way shifted in a lot of ways, the perceptions that we've been used to for many years in terms of health and safety in travel, in terms of where epidemic normally would happen, and from a north-south perspective, or from a, let's say, global majority world versus minority world, whichever term you may want to use. The reality is that now with Europe and of course the United States being now pretty much the epicenter of the pandemic, the perspective and the questions that we need to ask possibly are a little different. And why I say this is because obviously, if you look at these WHO representation of the pandemic in the globally, and when it did affect the African continent, which are the parts in the purple square that I've indicated. So what we understand is that, of course, if you compare numbers, it's probably a mere, I would say, probably simplistic comparison. And of course, the idea that the pandemic arrived much later, and potentially the level of preparedness because of previous epidemics like the Ebola may have played as an advantage in some of the destination. Notwithstanding, of course, the difficulties and the challenges, which I will discuss in a minute, of, in a way, containing, tracing, and of course, addressing the issue at the continental level. Now, the reason why I'm using this parallel between the Ebola virus disease and the COVID-induced and COVID pandemic is because what we experienced in 2014 was that there was very much a level of stigmatization of a region of the world because obviously of a disease that was obviously difficult to manage until probably about a year and a half after, versus something which, as we know, is now a global pandemic, which has led to 96% of the worldwide destination having some kind of travel restriction in place, and some 170 countries having their border closed. So that's probably the most, I would say, serious thing that have happened. But these measures have been put in place during the SARS, during the Ebola, and in a number of other incidents that have happened in the last 20, 30 years. What is the problem now is the fact that, of course, this is a global issue. But if we go back to the African continent, one of the things that we need to bear in mind is that what happened with the Ebola virus disease epidemic in 2014, in March 2014, when the first reported case was actually shared in the press, poses us some point of reflection and potentially point of reference to learn from. And indeed, one of the reflections that we may want to have in our mind when we talk about the recovery process is that if you look at this slide and you look at the dates of March 2014, when the Ebola outbreak obviously was announced publicly in the press, and the time when actually the cases decreased in the region, and also the tourism sector somehow started recovering properly, we're talking about pretty much almost a year and a half. Of course, in terms of the Ebola-induced tourism crisis, all the measures that we are seeing today, they are not new things. We have been through that process. This is a picture at Gatwick Airport when I was returning from the Gambia a few years back, in 2015, in fact. But the things that we have actually learned is that, of course, there is an issue with the duration of the crisis after the declared end of an epidemic at that time. Now we're talking about a pandemic. So the consequences might be much more extensive in temporal and spatial terms. There was a total lack of preparedness and capacity to deal with the magnitude of the Ebola outbreak. That was a fact. The Ebola exacerbated already some very fragile tourism industry context. And also what happened was that the sector continued with a business as usual message, which did not work at all in terms of crisis communication methods. And I would say that here we've learned a huge lesson, which is changing and is different now when actually the communication strategies from global players like the UNWTO, the WTTC, and also local and continental players is being actually quite targeted. Some said that the UNWTO could have played a stronger role in supporting the sector in better managing the situation, which is now obviously taking a much more focused approach, particularly in the African context. And in terms of the post-crisis recovery approach, there was some level of official implementation that had to be qualified in terms of the effectiveness, as well as a number of issues to do with the stigmatization of destinations, where you had imagery that depicted obviously people wearing the PPE versus the beautiful beach, for instance, of the Gambia, who, despite, for instance, not having had any case of Ebola, had their industry totally destroyed for about for an entire season. Now, what is interesting about these contexts is that for the first time, the African Union is very much looking at tourism as one of the key pillars in the economic context of the continent. And what is actually really interesting is that the impact and the lesson learned from the Ebola has brought us to reflect on those exogenous and endogenous effects of tourism and the disruption of economic activities that this is bringing. However, I would like to highlight two things which are somehow potentially being a little not ignored, but not addressed as effectively as they should. We talk about the impact of COVID on travel, on the aviation, on the hospitality sector, on labor. And what I'm seeing is insufficient action, or at least advocacy and interest towards understanding how the local tourism players are being supported. In the African context, the work of what we call it the invisible sector, for instance, small and medium entrepreneurs, individual entrepreneurs, are sometimes, I would say, forgotten. I'm going to share with you, and I hope this video will work, a very short video which was obviously published in this very interesting article by WD Media. And this one should give you a bit of an understanding of what I'm referring to.
Normally, Fred Mukasa would be taking tourists out on safari, but now he's out of business. All his bookings have been cancelled thanks to coronavirus.
By this time, I should be in the field. I should be in the park looking for lions with clients. But here I am, I'm in Kampala right now, doing a lot of nothing. And it is actually affecting my family too, because I entirely depend on tourism to sustain my family.
Mukasa saw how tourism was taking off in Uganda and began work as a tour guide. He took out a loan to buy a truck. Now he's wondering how he will pay for it.
I'm supposed to deposit like 1.8 to the bank every month, but right now I'm not working. So I don't know where I'm going to get the money to service the loan that I have in the bank. We are really affected so much. Everything is on a standstill.
It is a problem facing the entire industry. With rooms empty, hotels have been forced to lay off workers.
And everybody is looking at us to see what we are going to do. But one of the biggest challenges we have is the lack of knowledge of how long this will continue. As a pessimist, you're looking at having lost the month of March, April, and May. But still, that doesn't really, it's not conclusive because this could continue until perhaps the end of the year.
Uganda earned over $1.5 billion from tourism last year, mostly from foreign visitors. The country has recently run campaigns to promote domestic tourism. So far, tour operators say its contribution to the industry has been modest. And now even that has been cut off, as Ugandans too are told to stay at home. For Mukasa, this only adds to the uncertainty, not just about how long the pandemic will go on, but whether the tourists will return when it's over.
So, what is obvious is that the impact of the COVID-19 on independent tour operators as well is one of the examples of how what is happening now is really creating in some of the destination in the African context. One other issue which somehow is being missed in terms of the impact of tourism is the impact of COVID on the very assets that actually attract tourists in the first place. There are only few media outlets who have focused on the impact of lack of tourists on some of the engagement that the sector have with wildlife conservation and local livelihood that emerges from that. And I think this is something that needs to be a bit more central in the agenda as we speak, because at the end of the day, as much as the cultural aspect of the destination in Africa, as we know, the safari and obviously the wildlife product is certainly one of the most central one at continental level. And this should not be forgotten in our debates. So when we talk about the impact of COVID and the transition that has been from some of the over-touristified places to the COVID-induced tourism crisis, it is obvious to me that the impact of COVID in terms of tourism is very much widespread to a number of sustainable development goals. And I'm using here the sustainable development goals very much to map the implication of having no tourists traveling in the continent, ranging from women engagement in the sector. As we know, women account for a larger proportion of tourism and hospitality workforce, and the risk associated for them to become more vulnerable and more dependent, potentially be more, I would say, susceptible to level of abuse and violence becomes very much concerning, to issues to do with peace, justice, and in institutional management. Because as we know, when economic crisis strike following from a potential health-related crisis, the risk is that already vulnerable destination might incur into even further risk of lack of peace and potential local conflicts. What we have seen, though, as a positive outcome of this is that there is a very strong, I would say, move towards and willingness to collaborate. And at continental level, there have been a number of institutions, some of them are obviously led by the UNWTO, but also some regional and local initiatives, which are really much looking at how can we be proactive in the way we address this current situation. Because again, as we said earlier, and as Joseph mentioned in the previous presentation, people might be more propense towards traveling domestically or regionally. And of course, with many of the African destinations depending very much for up to 80%, 90% of their tourist arrival from the European or the North American markets, you can understand that the challenges becomes much bigger. However, what we have come to terms with is the fact that the challenge is how do we make sure that in parts of Africa and parts of Europe, I mean, I come from Italy, and you know, the concept of social isolation for an Italian person, an average Italian person who is used to hug and kiss everybody, is really something culturally difficult to grasp. And equally, you know, in many African contexts, or the issue of social isolation has become a real big challenging factor. But also in terms of understanding the seriousness of this issue. So on one side, you have had a really proactive way of containing the pandemic. So for instance, in Ghana, I'm aware of the closure of the beaches, the closure of bars and restaurants, in the very early stage of when the first few cases were discovered, to actually situations whereby local community members, you know, have continued pretty much with their normal lifestyle in many ways. But of course, there are a number of emerging scenarios that we need to be aware of. And the first one, which we may look at, and again, these are all assumptions based on what the discussion we are having in the continental level may be leading to think about. So the first scenario, and let's say the most optimistic one, is that the industry may bounce back within 6 months. And this is what we really hope for. In a way, this is what happened in some destinations in West Africa after the Ebola, only few of them. But those who had a diversified product, and a product which was not seasonal as much as in other parts of the continent, where the product was very much, the arrivals were very much linked to specific months of the years. But the idea is that the increasing push is to have, of course, government support, issues of as we have discussed before, how do we organize for for a more domestic travel pattern? How do we look at some regional collaboration, and also the possibility that the first markets to recover would be the regional and, of course, the business travel and potentially the luxury travel. Why I've put the luxury travel in this? Because I was following some forecasts recently in the European and here in the UK as well, in terms of what people would like to do after lockdown. And a lot of those people belonging to the upper bracket of income generation, and those who may have a secure job after this is over, we're saying that actually the first thing they would like to do is to travel, and to travel internationally as soon as possible. So what we may see is that the luxury travel bracket might remain in place. But one of the things that the reason why we're potentially looking at a long-term, let's say a longer term, so a medium, slow recovery of up to 12 months, is because the industry needs to adapt itself. So for instance, even the issue of social distancing, we are seeing, you know, how would people practice social distancing on international flights, or even, you know, how will we be able in African continents to shift from what is primarily group travel into more, I would say, niche, bespoke type of packages. That is something that may take a bit longer. And also the issue of domestic tourism, which, like what Joseph said in the Asia-Pacific context, sometimes has been in a way ignored, because, you know, people who can travel, people who have got sufficient money to travel internationally would prefer to do that compared to the more local and domestic thing. But this may well change. And this is what the push that we are having, or the advocacy that we are seeing evolving in the current state of play. And also the risk, though, that we may need to be aware of, and, you know, being a university professor, obviously in this uncertainty, we don't know what the sector will present, but maybe this is the right time to, let's say, reframe what and rethink about what is happening now. You know, now there are a number of containment measures being put in place. Tourism boards are being pushed to become national organizations responsible for the emergency planning. But what we are seeing is a lack of potential resources allocated to really do this effectively, or even, you know, the lack of expertise. And this is something that we already had during the Ebola outbreak. At the end of the day, people in tourism boards are people tasked to market destination, to sell product. They're not crisis management specialists. So effectively providing them the right support to deal with such a crisis of, as we say, of a never seen before, is something that would be essential. As much as supporting ministerial institutions and international and local organizations to really understand how can you access the measures that are being put in place, how that individual entrepreneur, for instance, from Uganda, could be guided to potentially access the support that is available at national level if available. It's an essential question, because not everybody is being trained to address, you know, situations such as the one we are currently facing. Communication has got a huge part to play. We've seen this through the Ebola outbreak, but what we've learned from that is that transparent, regular and open communications about the crisis is fundamental. And in the African continent, particularly now, where we are, the destination are not as badly affected as other parts of the world, is fundamental. And purely also because there is an element where stigmatization needs to be removed. And, you know, I've been hearing a lot of people saying, oh, Europe may be maintaining their border on lockdown, not to allow Asian or African or other parts of the world residents traveling to Europe. Now, actually, let's reframe this. Let's rethink at what is happening currently. Europe is the epicenter at the moment of the pandemic. So actually, other parts of the world may start doing what we were thinking as European to do to others in the past. So let's rethink from different sides how the situation may evolve. What they say that should happen, and this is where I'm coming to wrapping up my presentation, is that, of course, tourism needs to be firmly placed in national agenda and national priorities. And of course, one of the challenges and the changes that needs to be done is that there is a need for consolidating action. So for instance, even in terms of having shared agenda for addressing this, it's paramount that organizations such as global international development organizations like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and other institutions such as that would have a direct dialogue with intermediaries that are obviously sitting at continental level, whether it is the African Union, whether it is UNWTO as a tourism-specific UN body. It's important that any action needs to be coordinated so that, of course, individual destinations could be guided in the next step. What we've learned here and this is where I think a point of reflection that we need to understand is fundamental, is that it's now more than ever important to reframe the way we see tourism globally, but in Africa particularly. Those two articles from Kruger National Park are quite interesting, because if you look at the dates, the article on the left was from the 3rd of January 2020. The one on the right side is from 17th of April 2020. Pretty much same location, two different, very different scenarios, which have been obviously associated with a very sudden shift. So the question is, how much is too much or too little? Now, what we can agree on is the fact that many people don't believe over-tourism is an issue, right? And, you know, I've had this ongoing conversation with a number of colleagues internationally, and my answer is a bit probably drastic in a way, because I believe that if we don't believe that over-tourism is an issue, is almost trying to believe that climate change does not exist. We just look at the symptoms of what climate change, the climate change problem or emergency is. You know, the change in the season, the rain, the heavy rains, all the various symptomatic things. Equally, in terms of over-tourism, we may just lose ourselves in concentrating more on the management of the symptoms, like the overcrowding element. So the question is, when it comes to Africa, what is the difference between what we have done with our wildlife in Europe and US, and what obviously the importance of maintaining the pristine areas of the African wilderness context? Now, and what is the difference, for instance, between having too many tourists arriving in a Mercy village in Ethiopia versus too many tourists arriving in a Ramblas in Barcelona? Maybe the difference is that we have a different correlation context. There is a different situation in terms of understanding what we need to do in order to facilitate an understanding of what the over-tourism implication might be. And in this particular moment, when actually there are no tourists, you know, the lions are sunbathing in the middle of the road, is probably the right time to stop and rethink the way we've been designing and promoting tourism. So to conclude, everybody is talking about a new normal. Yet, I must say, nobody really knows what this new normal is, or at least I don't know. We may be in a situation where tourists may reject the past models, but I don't know, maybe I'm a little pessimistic, but to me, it seems as going back to the old model might be very much on the books in a lot of destinations. Now, will people travel again? Yes, of course they will. And also we need to remember that we adapted ourselves to a number of practices, like some of us were traveling in Africa, the yellow book for yellow fever with our injections, or, you know, we have customized to the impact of terrorism and the checks we have to go in airports. So as an academic and practitioner, my call is possibly to continue studying the phenomenon, and most importantly, to work collaboratively with those on the ground to very much deliver on what is needed now more than ever, which is sector agility, crisis preparedness, and restructuring tourism to shape that new normal that we will all want for our future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Marina. That was an inspiring contribution. We enjoyed it very, very much. Now we have time for our questions. So let us have a look. Okay, I've got one question here for you, Claudio. Thank you for your rich and useful presentation. How do you think OTAs such as Booking.com should rethink the role in a travel post-COVID world. And this comes from Julia.
I guess that as I mentioned before, after the financial crisis in 2008, never could imagine that a platform like Airbnb could actually had a key role and in the tourism industry. So right now, probably online travel agency will be probably facing new expectation and needs. So as I mentioned, probably because it's difficult to forecast what how the tourism mobility will change, but probably needs of health and security, information about travel policy, return policies, travel insurance, hospitals, or wherever you may need during your vacation in terms of health security and safety, probably can be part of how OTA, an online travel agency, needs to be prepared and also offer those kind of information for travelers.
Thank you so much, Claudio. And now I've got a question for Joseph. In the midst of a massive crisis, is this the best time to emphasize degrowth and over-tourism? Lack of growth and under-tourism seem to be the urgent problems of the time. And this comes from Jim Butcher. Thank you, Jim. Over to you, Joseph.
Thank you, Jim. You have to buy me a beer next time I see you. Okay. That's a tricky question, right? Because for all of the discussions we've had about over tourism and degrowth, not just in tourism but economic degrowth generally, your question reminds me of the phrase that is often thrown about, right? Be careful what you wish for, you might just get it. Because in some ways we've been pushed kicking and screaming towards degrowth, and we've seen what a degrowth environment might look like in the short term. And to some degree, perhaps Jim's question is motivated by the way many developed country economies, and I point to Australia and the US in particular and China, are talking about economic reopening very quickly, because clearly the economic pain is being felt, right? But the question, the broader implication for what's happening now is, when we see what we've had to deal with as a result of degrowth, we can do two things. We can what we say here in Australia, run around like a headless chicken and say we must return to the norm, or to use the word Marina had, reflect on where we find ourselves and say, what must we change? Now, one of the things we know is that many of those who are interested in social and ecological change will say that we've gone past the tipping point and we need to unwind things and return. So I'm probably not giving Jim a very satisfactory answer, but inevitably, it seems that the economic imperatives might decide what we end up doing and how quickly we end up doing it. It might not necessarily be what we want, I think. It might not just necessarily mean a continued pattern of degrowth. I think it's more or less a case of watch this space, right? Because, I mean, things are unfolding rapidly. Ask me in 2 months, Jim.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. I think we can conclude that there is no more to go home tourist protests. We'll see them anyway in the near future. And destinations with the over-tourism problems, they may go, the wish come true, but we shall see. We'll have a different type of tourism. Okay, so our next question is for Marina. That's for you. Most countries in Africa, e.g. Kenya, is still struggling to attract tourists and increase number of tourist arrivals. Does it mean over-tourism is not really an issue in Africa? And that comes from Joy Gupil. Over to you, Marina.
Okay, thank you very much, Joy, for the question. Indeed, there are certain areas. I mean, the issue of over-tourism is something that started affecting a number of destinations. Of course, you know, the issue is not as substantially problematic as in other parts of the world. However, as you have seen in the pictures that I showed at the very beginning of my presentation, there are destinations, and in Kenya particularly, where the combined effect of international and domestic visitation were beginning to expose critical pain points and at local level. So those pain points needs to be in a way looked at. Possibly this is the right time to look at and understand how indeed the evident patterns of development are similar to those encountered in developing country contexts elsewhere. Or also if there are those pain points in certain areas which are potential urban settings. I mean, one of the photos I shared with you was from Durban Beach in South Africa versus the more rural areas, or even the historical sites like the pyramids in Egypt. The need to understand the capacity constraints is an important and needed issue to address. I mean, I've been working with national parks in a number of African destinations. I'm not going to name countries, but I can tell you, having worked in 22 countries in the past 20 years, I still have today national parks in destination in Africa who do not yet even have a carrying capacity level determined as we speak. Or if they do have it, is in a report written in the drawer of hidden in a drawer, and of course is not really looked at as a way to manage the natural environment. And it's the same in the cultural setting. As I said earlier, you know, there is a push for cultural heritage. We have seen a number of tourism encounter based on authenticity. You know, we need to understand what is the situation with the implication of having huge number of people or even small group arriving into remote, rural, indigenous community settings and expecting that tourism experience. So this is why, and that is the determinant that are at the basis of the African potential over tourism. And this is the right time to look at it and try to change it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Marina. So our next question, I think, have we said that one, Claudio? Thank you for your rich and useful presentation. How do you think OTAs such as Booking should rethink the role in travel post-COVID world? From Julia.
I think this is the same question we had before, I would say.
Yes, I think it is, yes. Let us select another one now. Okay, I have the ones from Jim Butcher, Marina, Claudio.
There is one, Eugenia, about changing patterns to less crowded places.
Okay, I haven't seen that one. Yes, would you like to reply to that one, Marina?
No, I think it was more for Claudio, probably.
Oh, Claudio, okay, Claudio.
Yeah. Well, actually, the opportunity that over tourism could have given to less crowded places was already on the debates. Actually, Booking.com came out a couple of months ago with a report highlighting the opportunity for secondary cities. Actually, this is, if we go back to one of the theoretical framework we have used to analyze the phenomenon, and we think about a classic theory of like the spatial fix offered by David Harvey, for example, or the concept of tourist bubble of a geographer like Jude. The trends in tourism and in our contemporary world, in our neoliberal stage, is always to geographically expansion and to offer new cultural icon, new space of consumption, a new reference of consumption. So probably we can also, from a materialist point of view, we can also understand overtourism as a crisis of overaccumulation. So usually those crises of overaccumulation in our neoliberal stage are solved with spatial fix, so with spatial solution. So those opportunity for a less crowded destination or secondary cities were already on the debate a couple of months ago before COVID-19. So probably now with the needs and the expectation of having safe places, or as I show in my presentation, the debate we are having in Italy, or how we can organize summer season on our coastal destination, probably could be those kind of spatial solution could be a response to overtourism, but also to the post-COVID situation and post-COVID context.
Okay, Marina, would you like to add anything to this?
Well, what I would add to that is the fact that indeed there will be a propensity for visitors to look for, I would say, more bespoke and, of course, let's say less bespoke experience in less crowded places. I probably foresee the natural environment as one of the preferred locations, like remote natural spaces, which again, you know, if I look at it from an African point of view and a continental perspective, there are a lot of those potential resources to be looked at. And that's why I feel that the risk is that we could become in Africa victim of our own success in potentially providing that diversified product. So that's where I think the planning aspect of even niche tourism experiences, and I've seen there is another question which had come in on the role of small and medium enterprises in tourism, which I will link to that.
Yeah.
This is where their role is actually in potentially working collaboratively or in cooperatives, and there are a lot of those really happening in the African context, and really revisit their product in that sense. However, the challenge is there. You know, if we look at the individual tour operators, like our Ugandan example we had earlier, unless the government is prepared to support them, or in some cases, in the most advanced destinations, tourism association, hospitality association are prepared to also support SMEs and individual players. It is very, very difficult to understand how this could be implementable. And that is really the priority that we should look at. I mean, there is Judy Kefagona, which I mentioned earlier, who is the director of Sustainable Travel and Tourism Kenya. She she was sharing with me the other day that their main challenge is how they support the small and medium entrepreneurs to even address those measures, relief measures. So how do they, and it's not about training, it's about mentoring, it's about supportive activities. And this is, I think, in that sense, when it comes to being able to provide that diversified experience to the customers, which we look for something different, the sector needs to be more prepared and more proactive in how this is going to happen.
Thank you so much for this contribution, Marina. Now we have a question here for Claudio and Joseph. In the last few years, European people started traveling to Asian countries, and in the same way, Asian people, specifically Chinese, loving visiting European cities. Now then, after the crisis, do you think that the EU thinks to be affected to be another possible contagious outbreak like COVID-19 is able to close the borders with Asia to avoid it? And this is from Roberta Cataneo. So should they close the borders? Okay. Can I start with you, Claudio?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Well, of course, the relation we have, touristically speaking, in terms of mobility between Asia and Europe are huge. Destination like Barcelona, Venice, Italian destination such as Florence or Rome, of course, they offer also or mainly on Asian tourists. We have had a couple of days ago with some practitioners here in Barcelona that are working in institutional organization, that they were actually afraid that we could experience a kind of phobia of local people, the residents, of receiving massive flux of visitors. So probably in the short period, as already mentioned by Professor Chia, domestic tourism or proximity tourism could be the way to come out from the crisis. So those kind of long distance mobility could be probably not the way out in the short periods, and this would be a problem for those economies that are really depending on Asia tourism, or all the way around Asian economy that are really depending on backpackers, European backpackers and European visitors.
Okay, thank you very much, Claudio. And now if I can pass you over to Joseph. Joseph, could you reply to this question as well about...
Yes, thanks, Eugenia. Well, that's a really good question. Sitting here in Australia, one of the things that's become quite obvious is that, and I think the question is based around, to what extent will tourists be victimized when they're traveling, right? We see here in Australia, yeah, there is some of that victimization against people who are Chinese or Chinese looking, you know, as the cause of the virus in the first place. But at the same time, in Japan, where I was 4 weeks ago, we see foreigners also, you know, non-Asian foreigners being looked at suspiciously as carriers of probably the virus. I think it's very difficult to generalize. I think there may be small pockets of victimization, but on the whole, the bilateral relation between tourists and hosts and the economic impact of that relationship will probably overcome any of these kinds of things. The second part of the question is, can you be more selective about who comes to the destination, right? Now that's a really tricky one. If I can offer an example, here in Australia, they're talking about a special kind of travel relationship between Australia and New Zealand. So Australians can go to New Zealand and New Zealanders can come to us because we've managed to keep things under control. That might work in Europe, right? Where European countries might have the same kind of approach. I think the really important questions, the question is more about, how do we manage it? And that's a more tricky thing.
Okay, and I've got here a question for you again, Joseph. What do you see as the distinctive challenges for Asia Pacific from other regions in the globe? And what kind of actions are needed for the distinction? And this is from Vasna K.
Okay, thank you for that question. Presumably, the question comes from Asia. And I think if we looked at some of the data I presented before, that the engine for tourism growth has been China in Asia. Without Chinese nationals going abroad, I think that will have a big impact on visitation. But there are already talks in Southeast Asia about encouraging travel amongst Southeast Asian countries. And I think perhaps the distinctive thing for Asia will be, firstly, how do many of these large countries like India and China drive domestic tourism? And then the next step is, how do we encourage people from neighboring countries to visit us? So short haul and medium haul travel rather than long haul.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joseph. And now I have got a question for you, for Professor Novelli. And this comes from Gisbert Hoekendum from University of Johannesburg in South Africa. Could you please identify possible places of over-tourism in Africa? And how should African governments address the notion of degrowth that is very difficult to do in developing economies? And this is for you, Marina.
Right. I kind of responded to this question before, and in my presentation with the first question, with the first slides I had about the issue of specific areas, whether they are coastal areas, whether they are urban areas, or whatever else might be perceived as being either temporal over tourism due maybe to public holiday related flow of people to the beach, for instance, and so local and domestic players having a big role in the over-touristification of destinations. I mean, I'm not going to list a number of destinations because it would be inappropriate for me to point finger on specific issues, but I've already mentioned earlier one specific one, which is to do with the management of public spaces, public tourism spaces. An example of our national parks. You cannot have national parks which have been running since the post-colonial time, or still since the colonial time in some contexts, in a way where current capacity measures are not in place, where the labor forces don't have the resources that are required to actually operate in a human and professional way. The issue is that over the past 20 years, we have dehumanized workforce in tourism. I've still visited, not long than probably 6 months ago, destinations, national park in some African destination where workforce had been living in very, very poor conditions. For instance, at the border of the national park, in camper vans with no sanitation provision. And this is not acceptable in the 21st century, particularly when the income generated through national parks is really high. The problem is that the income generated in some of those national parks goes to the central government. And in very many cases, they are not reallocated to the management of those sites. And it's the same thing in coastal or urban settings. So to answer to the question is, the real issue with over-tourism and over-touristified spaces in some locations, okay, in the African context, in some of the African destinations, not all the African destinations, of course, we're talking about specific context, would be to actually revisit the model which have been promoted for so long and they've been just mismanaged or ignored because tourism was so much, or tourism growth was promoted as the right path. So that the growth paradigm is not necessarily about degrowing the access, the number is about creating a degrowth model which potentially could impact on the wider context. Because if you still have in the 21st century issues with tour guides, which spend some of their money to buy alcohol in their community, so having huge social impact, or you have coastal destination in Africa where the issue of sex tourism is still a huge social problem. You know, we need to understand what is the real issue with overtourism. And the more we ignore those issues, the more we're going to have a sector which we are actually complacent with, and we don't do anything about it, even in the future, once COVID is done and gone.
Thank you, Marina. I have here a question for Professor Claudio. Could post-COVID-19 influence travelers' decision to travel to less crowded place? So it could be a good thing for tourism. We can see a different type of tourism. That's
well,
for you.
Yeah, as mentioned before, it could be on the short period. Could be on the short period, and here we are talking a lot about, at least at the European level, and in Spain or in Barcelona, in Catalonia, in that proximity. It could be and domestic travel could be a domestic tourism could be a solution on short period. The point is for us as academics and researchers, that this phenomenon and this potential solution on the short period will open up new space in disputes. Second homes traveler or second home visitors, lifestyle migrants, of course, can open up the other issue and space in dispute that we do have to face from a critical perspective in academia on how those developments will tackle issues like the labor market, the temporary job, land grabbing, and we will have probably an explosion of issue related with those issues. So we need to be really and we need to pay attention on the next developments, because of course will be space in disputes that we have and we need critical to face and research and observe.
Thank you, Claudio. Now I have a question here for all three of you. How much more might virtual travel now become an option in tourism? E.g., Faroe Islands are offering virtual tours right now through tour guides as a way of compensating for cancellations. And this is from Manuela Bast. Can I start with you, Claudio?
Okay. Well, we have seen that, for example, Airbnb was with big crisis that they are experiencing right now in terms of the housing tourism markets. Now they were trying to get into the augmented reality experience, virtual experience. What I do think that tourism is about cultural encounter. Is about, we are still, as an anthropologist, we have been so much into the debate of authenticity in tourism since the 60s. But it is still appropriate in talking about tourism authenticity and seeking authenticity in the travel experience. Also, if authenticity is a social construction. So in China, we have seen a mimetic urbanism. We have seen now for those kind of temporary attraction like Northern Lights, where in Iceland you can have those experiences with augmented reality. But still, authenticity, being a social construction, is still something that we cannot replace, at least right now. Let's see in a couple of years, or probably in some months. But still, tourism is dealing with cultural encounter and with real experience.
Okay, thank you very much, Claudio. Can I move on to you now, Joseph? What is your view about virtual travel?
Yeah, thanks, Eugenia. Well, I kind of see its main utility as in terms of marketing and destination awareness. Whether it replaces actual travel is quite questionable, right? So I see it as something that people will engage in the dreaming phase of considering travel, rather than being a replacement. As Claudia says, the tourist encounter is a physical one. It's you know, we can't experience culture and people and place without being there fully. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. And Marina, would you like to add something to this as well?
Yes, of course. I mean, I think the old virtual, the tourism goes by a virtual campaign, which I think has been fantastic globally, but I can see this happening more and more from specific African destinations. Is definitely a huge help in terms of maintaining people interested in destinations. And I'm going to use a couple of very interesting examples. You know, the whole keep dreaming message about going in those remote areas, whether on a beautiful sandy beaches in the Seychelles Islands, or on a safari in the back of beyond of Botswana, for instance. You know, I think it's in the imagery that people have. You know, you can't travel physically, you do it virtually. So in that sense is huge. There is, so in terms of communication and maintaining the market ready and interested. There is a second point, is about solidarity, which is a message that I think we are promoting in a number of task forces group, from UNWTO to more localized contexts, where the role of communication in giving a solidarity message towards the continent in terms of the importance of tourism can only be defined by giving positive message. What tourism has done is to also create those fantastic destinations. And this last point is more specific to what tourism board are doing. And I'm going to use one example. I mean, I'm not a huge IT expert, but I'm kind of familiarizing myself more and more with the whole social media context. And certainly I'm following a lot of the activities on Twitter or Instagram, for instance. And I think that one of the campaigns that I liked very much, being a foodie myself, is, for instance, what the Ghana Tourism Authority has done recently, showcasing a number of mouth-watering foods that come from the country. The same thing with other parts of the continent. So again, you know, having been there, all this does for me is willing to go back. In fact, in my last slide, I mean, I had pictures of all my last trip to Ghana and my projects which are ongoing. So people like me that use travel for business, but also as a way to reconnect with people which share values with me. Of course, you know, in the virtual context is just used to keep in touch. But the first moment we're going to be able to meet again, this is going to be, for instance, the priority for me. And I suppose a lot of people will do the same, maybe traveling less for longer period. Will take a bit more time maybe to save money to be able to do that. But we will all go back to travel, and hopefully travel in a more sustainable way.
Yes, thank you, Marina. I have got here another question for you, so stay there with us. And this is from Carlos Santana. Yeah. It says, during the Ebola crisis, the destinations in Africa were stigmatized and people stopped traveling there. That is a huge problem. Do you forecast that in the future, the opposite could happen, that the destinations that overcame the pandemic could exclude tourists from some countries when we reopen again. China, Italy, Spain, for instance. So actually, this would be an opportunity for the destinations to choose where the tourists come from. So we have a more responsible type of tourism. What is your view on that?
Right. I think that question is twofolded. I'm a little worried about the conclusive aspect of the question, but I'll explain why. I think we need to start from a first point. This is not only a tourism crisis. Actually, it's not a tourism crisis. This is a humanitarian crisis, right? We have never seen such thing. And actually, whether you are located in the Asian context, in European, North American, or African, it doesn't really matter. What is said in the first part of the question about stigmatization, this is happening. This is already happening. You know, I'll tell you, I'll share with you my own experience. I'm an Italian person living in the UK. And I started wearing a mask and gloves going to the supermarket far before anybody else would do that in the UK, because I had already been following what happened in Italy. And yet now in the UK, we're in a similar context. And people were looking at me as if I was some kind of crazy, paranoid person. Guess what? Now we are in a situation where we have to move forward. In a more specific tourism context, people have been kicked out from properties in London. Not going to Africa, in London, people have been kicked out for being from a specific nationality, Italian, Chinese, Spanish, because of the perception and stigmatization about the disease. And this is a very dangerous move, a very dangerous move from whichever nationality you come from, because this reflects the very dangerous nationalist and populist agendas that are being flogged around the world at the moment. Again, I'm not going to refer to specific political leaders, but what we need to do when we talk about solidarity, when we talk about lesson to be learned, is that discriminating for whichever reason, whether it is because you have had the unlucky situation to be in a specific part of the world or to come from a specific part of the world, and a particular epidemic or a terrorist attack or a particular crisis have taken place, doesn't mean that it's acceptable to change the way we see things. And that's where I come to the second half about, should we be more selective in terms of how destinations choose where tourists come from? Well, I would be really worried if when I turn up with my Italian passport at the border, people will just look at me as if some potential huge danger to their destination. And of course, I will understand that they would want to check and trace where I come from, right? So I think it's more important understanding the traceability of where people are traveling from rather than which passport they hold. And this is, I think, something that we all need as academic practitioners, international journalism organization, to give a very clear and strong message that this is absolutely unacceptable to select your tourists just based on nationality, rather than the risk associated with the potential existence of the pandemic.
Okay, so we have one more question, I think, the last one for all of you. Do you think that this crisis will end over tourism as we know it? Or will we go back to the situation before? So can I start with you, Marina, then move on to Joseph and last Claudia?
Right. I mean,
difficult one, tough one.
Difficult one. And again, as Joseph and Claudia and myself said initially, you know, at the moment the situation is so volatile, right? That it's very difficult to say. But one of the things that we need to say is that people have got a very short memory. And people tend to remove certain aspect from their, let's say, mental hard drive, and bad behaviors can come back very, very quickly. And I often, when I teach to my student, I make the parallel between a driver who has been driving a car for over 25 years. You know, when you start driving your car, you use the indicator, you make sure that you have both your hands on your steering wheel, and you move forward. And then something happened, an incident, an accident happened, and you go back, you know, to try and be good. Now, I wonder whether in tourism, that's what is happening. You know, we can compare to that situation where over-tourism is comparable to the driver driving with one hand, a cigarette in the other hand and a drink in the other, and potentially going back to a situation where we need to really think of how to do this properly, how to do this sustainably, and the recovery process could really take some lessons. You know, we need to go back to driving lessons and the ABC of what sustainable tourism is all about and how this could potentially help us in the future. And then maybe over-tourism could be out of the question, but I'm not too sure that will be the case.
Perhaps you will be talking about under-tourism.
Well, we
talk about growth, but growth.
We talk about under-tourism, and because not all destinations are affected by over-tourism. You know, there are destinations which are very much in need of tourism, and we will continue to support those to do it in the right way. That's the reality.
Yeah. Thank you, Marina. And now, Joseph, to you.
Thank you. And just to echo what Marina was saying, you know, because we're focused on tourism, we see this as a tourism crisis, but at a broader level, this is a planetary crisis more than anything, right? Tourism just happens to be one part of the overall planetary crisis we're looking at. And when we think about how tourism will change, will we return to the days of over-tourism again? I've just looked at my crystal ball and it's very foggy and unclear. So I think, you know, what we are talking about is behavior change, you know, and will we see behavior change in tourists? Will their expectations change of the types of holidays they want? If we look at cruise tourism as an example, and if we consider that, you know, 2021 looks like a much busier cruise season than 2019, raises the question, do people actually take any lessons from what we undergo? Can they make behavior change that is more responsible and sustainable and all of these other things that we want? That makes me feel very uncomfortable and not so confident that we as humans can change our behaviors, you know, our overarching ways of consuming and withdrawing from the planet. Are we in a position to be able to change that? I'm less confident about that, but I'm happy to be proven wrong.
And when you talk about behavior change, are we talking about the tourist behavior or the industry?
I think both. We can't separate one from the other, right? The industry can help drive behavior change, but ultimately consumers as well have a part in co-opting and buying into that change. You know, that the situation with low-cost airlines, we become addicted to very cheap airfares, right?
Yes.
Will we be prepared to pay more to travel? I don't know. Are we price sensitive? Do we need our holidays so much that price doesn't matter?
Thank you very much, Joseph. I know it's about 10 o'clock, is it, in Australia now, is it? So I'm keeping you up. Okay, just a few more minutes, I think. Claudia, would you like to add anything to our last question?
Yeah, I would probably add, as Professor Chia was talking about the tourist behavior and industry behavior, I would probably add also the political approach. So far, we have been talking about smart solutions, smart tourism, technical and technocracy as the solution or the potential solution for over-tourism related issue, but not just over-tourism, for the paradox of travel and tourism excesses. And we cannot spare any more of a political approach. Sustainable tourism could be considered at some point as an oxymoron. We do know that every time that we are traveling, we are we are like leaving a footprint, and there is a big impact for environmental speaking, culturally speaking, economically speaking, at both ways, and a positive and a negative impact. So what we can do is to maximize benefits and try to minimize negative impacts and negative effects of tourism. So I would probably add the political, political decision, the political point of view, a perspective in terms of having a more sustainable approach, and of course an inclusive approach where dynamics of participatory dynamics in tourism governance should be one of the key.
Okay.
Eugenia, can I just add one little thing to what Claudia just said in terms of political agenda?
Yeah.
And it is that for many years, when you talk to ministers of tourism, the way they refer as the success of their tourism industry, for instance, is how many more tourists will arrive in their destination year on year. We need to change the way we measure success. The parameters we use to measure success no longer work. Now, whether we talk about degrowth, overgrowth, undergrowth, under tourism or over tourism, we need to shift our political, socio-economical and environmental measurement parameters to make the industry and inform that new normal that we are all hoping for.
Thank you so much, Marina. Thank you very much, Claudius, Joseph, and Marina, for your engaging contribution to this discussion. Before closing, I would just like to thank all of you for joining us today. I hope that you have enjoyed this third webinar as much as we have. And the fourth webinar will take place next Friday, and we'll send out details shortly. Well, see you next week. Thank you so much. You've been fantastic, brilliant discussion today. And sorry to keep you, Joseph, a bit late. Okay, bye-bye all. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Everybody, thanks.